And this is Mick, the Doctor of Digital.
And welcome to Sex 101. Sex 101 is created to our world, created to empower our sexes and create relationships. Another week, another great episode. How one woman's shelter experience changed her world forever.
This is the story of Hawa's, and Hawa's story is for the podcast, and we're exploring protection, predators, and providence. We explore the complexities of human sexuality, relationships, and cultural dynamics through the lens of wisdom traditions that have guided humanity for millennia. We're examining a remarkable story that illuminates the intersection of faith, family protection, cultural displacement, and divine providence.
Divine Providence, indeed. We're examining a remarkable newsletter story from a young woman named Hua. What initially drew you her narrative, Mr. Mike?
What struck me immediately was Hawa's brutal honesty about what she calls her seemingly stupid decisions. She opens by referencing Baby Reindeer on Netflix, acknowledging how frustrating it can be to watch someone make choices that seem obviously dangerous. But as she unfolds her story, we see something far more nuanced, the collision between sheltered upbringing and predatory sophistication, and how divine providence can work through the most unlikely instruments. She's remarkably candid about self blame. This seems to echo patterns we see throughout history when women encounter violence. That self blame is a classic survivor response, but it obscures a deeper truth. What's fascinating is how this pattern appears even in biblical narratives. Consider Tamar in 2 Samuel 13. After her assault by Amnon, she tears her garments and puts ashes on her head, displaying the shame that society places on victims rather than perpetrators. The text doesn't blame Tamar, but she carries the burden of shame. What Hawa experienced wasn't stupidity, it was the predictable result of comprehensive protection without practical preparation. The early church father John Chrysostom, in his homily on Matthew, reminds us that God's providence is often hidden from our immediate view, working through circumstances and people we might not expect. In conclusion, Hawa's story becomes a perfect illustration of this ancient wisdom, but it also reveals how certain cultural approaches to protection can inadvertently increase vulnerability.
Vulnerability, indeed. But before we dive deeper into her experience, can you situate this within the broader Western tradition approach to women's protection? How has Christianity historically viewed the tension between sheltering and empowering women?
This is a crucial context. Early Christianity was revolutionary in its approach to women's protection and empowerment, though this has been obscured by later cultural overlays. In the Greco Roman world that Christianity emerged from, women were essentially property, transferred from father to husband with minimal agency. The paterfamilias system gave male heads of household absolute authority, including the right of life and death over family members. But Jesus' interactions with women were radically different. Consider his encounter with the woman at the well in John 4. He speaks with her publicly, acknowledges her complicated marital history without condemnation, and reveals his messianic identity to her first. She becomes the first evangelist to the Samaritans. In conclusion, the woman caught in adultery in John 8, Jesus refuses to participate in her shaming and instead challenges the male accusers about their own sin.
Mr. Mink, so Christianity initially offered a different model of protection.
Precisely. Paul's letters reveal women in significant leadership roles. Phoebe as a deacon and patron of churches, Priscilla teaching alongside Aquila, Junia described as outstanding among the apostles. The early church created protective communities where women could exercise spiritual authority and receive education. This was protection through empowerment rather than isolation. The church fathers continued this tradition. Chrysostom wrote extensively about the spiritual equality of men and women, arguing that in matters of virtue and salvation, gender was irrelevant. In conclusion, Augustine's relationship with his mother, Monica, shows profound respect for women's spiritual wisdom. Her prayers and guidance shaped one of Christianity's greatest theologians.
Mr. Mick, how does this shift over time?
The medieval period saw increasing restrictions, partly due to cultural pressures and misinterpretations of Pauline texts about women's roles. But even then, we see powerful examples of women's protection through Christian institutions. Medieval convents provided women with education, economic independence, and protection from forced marriages. Think of Hildegard of Bingen, mystic, composer, natural scientist, advisors to popes and emperors. The church provided her with the platform and protection to exercise extraordinary influence. The historical context makes Hawa's story particularly poignant. In conclusion, her father's approach, protection through isolation and fear, represents a departure from the early Christian model of protection through wisdom, community, and graduated empowerment.
Empowerment, indeed. So, Mr. Mick, let's examine Hugh's upbringing through his historical lens. She describes growing up under the comprehensive shelter, no socializing, limited cultural exposure, and direct transport between home and school. How these compare to biblical models of preparing young women for the world?
Howard grew up as the eldest daughter in a strict Muslim household in Nigeria, where her father's protective instincts created what she describes as comprehensive shelter from worldly dangers. While I deeply respect the intention behind such protection, it's worth examining how this approach compares to biblical models. The book of Proverbs, traditionally attributed to Solomon, offers extensive wisdom about preparing children, including daughters, for life's challenges. Proverbs 31 describes the woman of valor who is economically active, makes independent business decisions, speaks with wisdom, and is praised for her strength and dignity. In conclusion, this isn't a woman who was sheltered from the world, but one who was prepared to engage in it wisely.
Wisely, indeed. Totally wise. And the pivotal moment came from 15 years old or 15-year-old Q expressed natural curiosity about relationships. Her father's response was explosive, screaming at her in a locker until she feared that the glass would crack. What does a biblical wisdom may say about addressing adolescent development?
This moment reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of adolescent development and biblical principles. The father's approach was rooted in fear rather than wisdom. Contrast this with how the Bible discusses sexual development and relationships. The Song of Songs, despite being allegorized extensively, begins as a frank declaration and celebration of romantic love and sexual attraction. The young woman in the poem is active, articulate, and makes her own choices. She says, I am my beloved's, and my beloved is mine, expressing mutuality rather than ownership. More importantly, Jesus himself grew up in what Luke describes as normal family and community life. Luke 2:52 tells us Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. This suggests graduated development in multiple dimensions: intellectual, physical, spiritual, and social. In conclusion, the text implies Jesus had normal social interactions as he matured.
So, isolation was not the biblical model, Mr. Mac.
Not at all. Even in the Old Testament, we see young women like Ruth making autonomous decisions about their futures, or Esther being prepared for queenship through education and cultural training, not isolation. The biblical model seems to emphasize wisdom development alongside protection. St. John Chrysostom, in his treatise on the education of children, argues that parents who shield their children from all moral complexity do them a disservice. He writes, the soul that has never wrestled with temptation cannot distinguish between good and evil when faced with real choices. In conclusion, this directly contradicts the isolation approach Hawa experienced.
Mr. Mac. What about psychological research on this kind of protection?
Here's where ancient wisdom aligns with modern psychology. Dr. Peter Gray's research on childhood development shows that children experiencing extreme protection without graduated decision making opportunities develop what researchers call learned helplessness when facing novel situations. They literally don't develop the neural pathways necessary for independent moral reasoning. Augustine addresses this in his Confessions, reflecting on his own sheltered youth. He notes that when he finally encountered temptation, he was unprepared to resist it precisely because he had never practiced moral decision making. In conclusion, he writes, "You had not yet taught my soul to wrestle with desire because I had never learned to recognize desire's approach."
Hua herself recognizes this pattern, doesn't she?
Yes, with remarkable insight. She says, "My parents told me all the things to do, but didn't let me make decisions. And when it was time for life to test me, I failed." This echoes Augustine's observation that moral character is developed through practice, not just instruction. The tragedy is that Hawa's father, in trying to protect her from the world's dangers, actually made her more vulnerable to those very dangers. St. Augustine reminds us in his sermons that it is better to prepare the child for the path than to prepare the path for the child. In conclusion, while protection is natural and necessary, exclusive sheltering can create vulnerabilities rather than eliminate them.
Mr. Mink, this set up what you called a perfect storm. Comprehensive rules without practical wisdom. How does this prepare us for understanding what happened when Hua suddenly found herself navigating independence in a foreign country?
It creates exactly the conditions that predators look for: inexperience combined with isolation from protective community networks. But before we explore that encounter, it's worth noting how different this is from the early Christian model of community based protection and graduated empowerment. Ha was sent into the world with rules, but without the practical wisdom or community support that might have protected her. At 18, Hawa became an international student in India. From a historical perspective, the church traditionally supported people navigating cultural displacement. This is where early Christian practice becomes particularly relevant. The early church was essentially a network of displaced people, Jews and Gentiles, slaves and free, men and women from different cultural backgrounds trying to create new communities. Paul's letters are full of instructions for how these diverse groups should support and protect each other. The concept, hospitality to strangers, was central to early Christian practice. Hebrews 13:2 reminds believers to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing so, some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it. In conclusion, this wasn't just about being nice to visitors, it was about creating protective networks for vulnerable people far from their natural support systems.
Mr. Mink, what made Hua's situation particularly challenging?
The timing was crucial. Hawa arrived in India the same year that the country was grappling with highly publicized cases of sexual violence, specifically the brutal gang rape and murder of a woman that made international headlines. Her parents actually considered bringing her home, but a colleague's promise of protection convinced them to let her stay. This context is essential for understanding her vulnerability. In conclusion, she was living with documented evidence that sexual violence was not just possible, but visible and brutal. Yet she was operating within a moral framework that had never taught her to recognize predatory behavior.
How does this compare to early Christian approaches to protecting vulnerable community members?
The early church developed sophisticated systems for this. Paul's instructions to Timothy about caring for widows in 1 Timothy 5 reveal a community that took responsibility for protecting vulnerable members. Young widows were either supported by families or the church community, specifically to prevent them from being prey to predators or falling into destructive behaviors. Similarly, the Didache, one of the earliest Christian documents outside the New Testament, provides detailed instructions for testing traveling teachers and protecting communities from those who would exploit Christian hospitality. The early Christians understood that vulnerability required community vigilance. Yet Hawa was operating essentially alone, following rules but without community support. Despite the dangerous context, she maintained what she calls living by the book. No partying, straight A's, completing assignments on time, no smoking, drinking, or sexual activity. She was following all the rules she'd been taught, demonstrating that her character formation was actually quite strong. But as she puts it, no matter how much your parents shelter you, life will bring its test and you will have to face it alone. This isolation is the antithesis of early Christian practice. Chrysostom writes in his homily on Romans, when we see someone isolated from their natural guardians, we must become their guardians. In conclusion, the early church understood that moral behavior required community support, not just individual willpower.
Mr. Mick, when her task came, how this manifest?
2 years into her studies, she encountered what the patristic fathers would recognize as a testing of virtue in the world. St. John of Damascus writes in his exposition of the Orthodox faith that virtue untested is not true virtue, but merely innocence. But here's the crucial difference. Damascus assumes that tested virtue has been prepared through gradual training and community support. The predator Hawa encountered was sophisticated in exactly the ways that effective predators are. He was well dressed, chose public locations, engaged in seemingly innocent conversation, and gradually escalated his requests. In conclusion, these are textbook grooming behaviors that approximately 80% of sexual assault perpetrators use, according to statistics.
Mr. Mick, what made him so effective manipulation?
He understood exactly what someone from Hawa's background would find appealing and trustworthy. He said all the right things, as she puts it, probably appealing to her religious values, showing respect for her cultural background, demonstrating patience with her boundaries. By the end of their first encounter, she had already decided to maintain contact with him. This connects to a troubling pattern we see throughout history. Predators often specifically target individuals from protective religious backgrounds because they can exploit the very values whose backgrounds have been instilled in them. In conclusion, they present themselves as respectful, patient, and morally upright, which resonates with people raised to value these very qualities.
So her protective upbringing actually made her move vulnerable, Mr. Mick.
That's the tragic irony. Yes. Someone who had grown up making independent social judgments, learning to read people in various contexts, recognizing the difference between genuine respect and manipulative charm, they might have seen through this approach. But Hawa had been systemically prevented from developing that discernment. Augustine discusses this phenomenon in his City of God, noting how innocence without wisdom becomes vulnerability. The inexperience and soul mistakes calculation for kindness, manipulation for gentleness, predation for patience. This is where the story takes an unexpected turn, because protection came from the most unlikely source imaginable. And this is where we see providence working in ways that challenge all our assumptions about how God protects the vulnerable. In conclusion, the instrument of Hawa's salvation was someone she genuinely despised, and for very good reasons.
Enter Aditya. The figure embodies a moral complexity in ways that challenge simple categories. Tell us about him. How does this character reflect broader theological themes?
Aditya was a classmate whom Hawa generally despised for his racist behavior toward her. This wasn't casual insensitivity, it was pointed personal cruelty that went to the heart of human dignity. He once asked her if Google appeared black when she opened it because of her skin color. The depth of hurt in her description is palpable. His behavior was inexcusable by any moral standard and represented exactly the kind of evil that Christians are called to oppose. Yet, when danger approached, this same person became her protector. In conclusion, the theological complexity here is profound and connects to some of the most challenging questions in Christian thought about how God works through imperfect instruments.
How did this intervention unfold, Mr. Mac?
When Hao was preparing to leave her nice man, Aditya came to their table and flatly stated that she wasn't going with him. When she told him to leave, he escalated his intervention, threatening to report the situation to her school, potentially jeopardizing her visa application and German scholarship, and promising to inform her parents. His methods were coercive, using institutional and familial pressure rather than direct explanation. In many contexts, we might call this manipulative or controlling behavior. But consider what this intervention cost him personally, confronting Hawa's anger, potentially facing a dangerous man, taking responsibility for someone who openly despised him, and risking his own social standing. This seems to illustrate complex theological principles about providence working through flawed instruments. This perfectly illustrates what St. Augustine discusses extensively in City of God, how God's providence can work through imperfect, even morally compromised individuals to accomplish good. Augustine writes, God can bring good out of evil, not by making evil good, but by overruling evil for good purposes. The biblical precedents for this are extensive. Consider how God used Pharaoh's hardened heart to ultimately deliver the Israelites from Egypt, or how Judas's betrayal, while morally reprehensible, became the means of humanity's salvation, or how Paul, who persecuted Christians, became Christianity's greatest missionary. Augustine notes God's sovereignty is so complete that he can use even rebellion against his will to accomplish his purposes. This raises challenging questions about moral responsibility and divine sovereignty. Augustine struggled with these questions throughout his career, particularly in his debates with the Pelagians about grace and free will. The tension is this: if God can use evil people for good purposes, does this excuse their evil behavior? Augustine's answer is nuanced. God's use of evil for good purposes doesn't make evil good, nor does it remove moral responsibility from the evil actor. In Hawa's case, Aditya's racism remained morally wrong, even though God used him as an instrument of protection. The two judgments are separate. We can condemn his racist behavior while recognizing that providence worked through him to protect Hawa. Hawa initially responded to his intervention with complete cognitive dissonance. Her mind couldn't reconcile this protective action with her established understanding of Aditya's character. This is a well documented psychological phenomenon. When faced with information that contradicts our core beliefs about someone, we often reject the new information rather than revise our understanding. Leon Festinger's research on cognitive dissonance shows that humans will go to great lengths to maintain consistent beliefs about people, even in the face of contradictory evidence. Howard was furious, embarrassed, and completely resistant to his interference. From her perspective, this racist tormentor was now controlling her social choices. Her perspective began to shift gradually and required maturity. As she put it, as I grew older, I realized that Aditya was mean, but he wasn't evil, and there were some evils that even mean people are scared of. I think Aditya was scared of me. This represents sophisticated moral reasoning, the ability to hold multiple complex judgments about a person simultaneously. She maintained appropriate anger at his racist treatment while recognizing that his cruelty towards her was qualitatively different from the predatory evil he recognized in her nice man. This connects to broader themes in Christian theology about the complexity of human nature. Augustine's doctrine of original sin suggests that all humans are morally compromised, capable of both cruelty and compassion, selfishness and sacrifice. Aditya embodies this complexity perfectly. He was genuinely cruel to Hawa based on racist assumptions, yet he was also capable of recognizing predatory evil and taking personal risk to protect her from it. Chrysostom writes in his homilies on John, do not be surprised when you see virtue and vice existing in the same soul, for this is the same human condition until we are perfected in Christ. This theological insight helps us understand how someone can be simultaneously racist and protective, cruel and courageous. Providence chose an unlikely instrument, more than unlikely, seemingly contradictory, but this follows biblical patterns. God chose Moses, who had a speech impediment, to be his spokesman. He chose David, an adulterer and murderer, to be Israel's greatest king. He chose the Canaanite woman's great faith to teach the disciples about persistent prayer, even though Canaanites were considered enemies of Israel. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 1:27 that God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. Sometimes he also chooses the morally compromised things of the world to accomplish his protective purposes. This sets up devastating revelation that would transform Hawa's understanding of everything that had happened. In conclusion, sometimes we can only recognize God's protection in retrospect, when the full scope of the danger becomes clear and we understand how narrowly we escaped.
Mr. Mick, 3 months later, Hua experienced what can only be described as a horrifying epiphany. How this how does this moment illustrate theological principles about divine providence and human understanding?
While studying in Germany, Howe received a broadcast message about another gang rape in India. These had become tragically more common. She almost dismissed them, but something made her look closer, and there was her nice man among the perpetrators, the man who had been so patient, so charming, so seemingly gentle. He was one of the rapists. This moment represents what theologians call apocalyptic revelation, not in the eschatological end of the world sense, but in the literal meaning of apocalypse, unveiling or uncovering. Suddenly, the true nature of her near encounter was revealed, and with it, the true nature of Aditha's intervention. That moment of recognition must have been devastating. Imagine the sudden, horrifying clarity that transforms your entire understanding of a past event. Every interaction recontextualizes itself. The food offer, the hotel suggestion, his telling Aditha to leave them alone, and his patience during her interview. What had she had interpreted as kindness was revealed as calculated manipulation designed to isolate and victimize her. This connects to Jesus' teaching in Matthew 10:16 about being wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Hawa had the innocence, but lacked the wisdom, the ability to recognize predatory behavior disguised as kindness. The revelation provided that wisdom retrospectively, but at tremendous psychological cost. This kind of revelation affects survivors psychologically and spiritually. Psychologically, it creates what researchers call cognitive reorganization, the sudden restructuring of memories and meanings when new information fundamentally changes our understanding. Judith Herman's work on trauma recovery shows this process to be both traumatic and healing, as survivors finally understand their instincts for caution were valid. Spiritually, this kind of revelation often leads to what the mystics call dark night of the soul, the realization that we understand far less about our circumstances than we thought. Job experienced this when God's speeches revealed the limitations of human understanding. Job thought he knew why he was suffering. God's revelation showed him he understood almost nothing about divine purposes. And when there's a profound encounter with Aditya, it's described with emotional precision. When she finally emerged to that communal kitchen, she and Aditya exchanged a look that she describes as wordless but complete. This moment represents what Chrysostom calls the meeting of souls in truth, communication that transcends words because it touches on ultimate realities. Well, this time she recognized that Aditya's had gestures and good intent, comfort, normalcy, an attempt to lighten an unbearable moment through familiar interaction, even if that interaction was imperfect. Augustine writes in his Confessions, God uses us as we are, not as we might become, though he may change us through the using. Aditya's character flaws weren't eliminated by his role as Hawa's protector, but neither did he negate the reality of divine providence working through him. What had seemed like a missed opportunity was revealed as a narrow escape. And this reflects the biblical pattern of reversed understanding. Mary's song in Luke 1 about God bringing down the mighty and lifting the lowly, Paul's teaching about strength being made perfect in weakness, and Jesus' constant reversals of expected values in the parables. This connects to broader patterns of sexual violence and vulnerability. Hawa's individual story, while deeply personal, reflects global patterns that affect women everywhere, particularly those navigating cultural displacement and independence. In conclusion, understanding these patterns help us move from individual tragedy to community prevention.
Mr. Mick, how does Hua's individual experience reflect broader patterns of sexual violence, and how did early Christian communities address these challenges?
The statistics Howa shares are sobering. Approximately 35% of women worldwide have experienced sexual harassment. In India, there were 22,172 reported rape incidents per 100,000 citizens as of 2020. In Nigeria, 24.8% of females aged 18 to 24 have experienced sexual abuse, with only 5% seeking help and just 3.5% receiving services. The early church addressed these vulnerabilities systematically. Early Christian communities developed sophisticated approaches to protecting vulnerable members, particularly women in precarious situations. The church fathers were deeply concerned with what we might now call structural vulnerability, the ways that social displacement, economic dependence, and cultural isolation create opportunities for predators. These were women in unfamiliar contexts, like Howa. This was central to early Christian practice. The concept of love of strangers went beyond simple hospitality to include protective advocacy. Chrysostom preached extensively about this, writing, "When we see someone isolated from their natural guardians, we must become their guardians." And this applies to modern contexts like international education. The early church understood this intuitively. Paul's letters are full of instructions for how Christians in different cities should support and protect each other. Howa mentions experiencing a near assault when she didn't have an aditya. This tells us about the importance of protective community networks. Augustine addresses this in The City of God, noting that individual virtue, while necessary, is insufficient against systemic evil. He writes, "The lone soul, however virtuous, cannot withstand the organized malice of those who would do us harm. Protection comes through righteous community." Protective families and communities can learn from both Howa's experience and early Christian wisdom. In conclusion, this brings us to practical applications that bridge ancient wisdom with contemporary understanding.
As we conclude this, Mr. Mick, what practical wisdom can protective families and communities extract from Howa's experience, grounded in biblical principles and early Christian practice?
Howa's story offers crucial insights for families balancing protection with preparation, particularly when viewed through the lens of early Christian community practice. First, sheltered young people need graduated exposure to decision making in lower stakes environments. Second, education about predatory behaviors must go beyond rules to include recognition of manipulation tactics. Communities can extend protective networks beyond biological families. The early church created what historians called fictive kinship networks, chosen families that provided protection, economic support, and social accountability. Fourth, we must teach young people to trust their instincts while developing those instincts through experience and education. This connects to early Christian wisdom about practical preparation. This is one of the most powerful aspects of Howa's decision to share her story publicly. Her casual conclusion, "I don't know why I chose to tell this story today, but anyway, toodles," she exposed what would happen to her to help others. And Basil the Great teaches that when we have received some blessing from God's hand, we become debtors to extend that blessing to others in need. Howa's survival creates not shame or obligation, but an opportunity to transform experience into protection for others. Every story of survival contains wisdom for prevention. Every testimony of protection reveals patterns we can recognize and replicate. And every voice raised in honesty about vulnerability makes the next person softer and safer. In conclusion, the early church understood that healing happens not in isolation, but in community, not in silence, but in the brave sharing of truth.
Brave sharing of truth, indeed. Very well said, Mr. Mick. Very well said. And would you like to plug in something, Mr. Mick?
Sure, I appreciate the opportunity. That's Write the Book, Grow the Business, and connect on LinkedIn, GMake the Dr. Digital Smith, PhD. Also listen to the Doctor of Digital podcast. Pick up a couple volumes of myself on Amazon, Burning America, and On Track Ian Hunter.
Yes, people, lots about Mr. Mick, the Doctor of Digital, because if you support him, for sure, more and more empowering episode of the podcast and more empowering others to come. And please do listen to our baby podcast, Mental Health 101, because Mental Health 101 is created to empower our mental health awareness. So, Mr. Mike, thank you so much for your time.
Until next time, Deus Volt.
More to come, people. See you